Have you ever really thought about how languages actually begin? And I don't mean just, a couple of new slang words here and there, but a whole system of communication.
It's pretty mind-blowing when you actually consider it.
Totally. So get this. Today we are diving into a world that most of us, to be honest, know surprisingly little about.
We're talking about Mexican Sign Language.
LSM for short.
And this is a language with a really fascinating story, kind of constantly pushing back against a lot of assumptions and fighting for its place in the world,
And that's what's so cool about these deep dives, We're going way beyond those basic facts that you can just find on a website,
Yeah.
We're going deeper. We're talking about a living, breathing language,
Yeah.
one that's used by thousands of people.
Maybe even closer to 200,000.
Right. Primarily deaf individuals in Mexico.
And I think the first thing to totally ditch is this idea that it's just Spanish, but you're doing it with your hands.
Yeah, like hola, but with jazz hands.
Right. But no, seriously, that's just so far off. I mean, come on. That's like saying English and German are basically the same just because they're spoken in countries that are right next to each other.
Yeah. Good luck ordering a schnitzel in Germany if you only speak English.
Exactly.
Yeah. Our sources, they really highlight how LSM has its own unique grammar, its own sentence structure. It has ways of actually building meaning that are totally different from spoken Spanish.
Yeah. Think of it like this. All languages have systems.
Right.
Right. They have rules about how words go together.
Yeah.
And LSM, totally its own system. And it's just as complex and nuanced as any spoken language out there.
Which, I mean, that just makes you wonder then, where on earth did it come from? If it's not just Spanish on the hands, how did it even pop up?
Well, buckle up because the history is, it's a bit of a detective story, to be honest.
I love a good mystery.
So it all takes us back to 1869 in Mexico City.
Okay.
The very first school dedicated to deaf students opened up.
Wow, 1869. That's wow.
Right. Now, the teachers there, they came prepared.
Yeah.
They were armed with Old French Sign Language.
Old French Sign Language.
Yeah, we're talking OFSL.
OFSL. Okay.
OFSL.
Okay, I think I'm already seeing a connection here because I know ASL, American Sign Language, also has roots in OFSL.
Right.
But okay, hold on. Back to 1869 in Mexico. What happens when these teachers meet their students for the first time?
And that's where things get really, really interesting.
Okay.
Because the students, they weren't exactly starting from scratch. You see, they brought their own home signs, their own ways they had learned to communicate within their families, maybe within their communities. So now you had this incredible blending happening.
Like a language smoothie. All these different ingredients are mixing together.
Exactly. But instead of just a quick blend, imagine this happening over years, decades even. I mean, this is how languages naturally develop. They mix, they evolve, and ultimately they create something totally new, totally distinct.
Okay, so that explains how LSM came to be. But before we move on from this whole OFSL link, so ASL and LSM, they share this ancestor. So does it mean someone who knows ASL could just fly over to Mexico and have a conversation with someone using LSM?
See, that's the thing about languages. They never just sit still.
Yeah.
They're constantly changing, adapting. So yeah, ASL and LSM, they have that historical link back to OFSL.
Right.
But they've evolved so much that it's almost like they're distant cousins who barely even recognize each other at a family reunion.
Oh, wow.
You can't just swap one for the other and expect everything to be hunky-dory communication-wise.
Wow, that's wild. It
Right.
really highlights how much languages can completely transform over time.
Yeah, they really do.
So, okay, we've got this fascinating history, this language that's built itself up over generations, but what's the situation with LSM today? It really makes you think about all those taken for granted moments,
Yeah.
we're so used to having subtitles for films in other languages. But how often do we actually see interpretations for LSM or other sign languages?
Yeah, it's definitely a blind spot for a lot of people. And what we're missing is way more than just words.
Right.
When you overlook a language, you're kind of overlooking a whole culture, a whole community's way of seeing and experiencing the world.
It's true. And speaking of communities, you mentioned dialects earlier. Do we know how much LSM varies across different parts of Mexico?
Our sources mention that LSM has about 80 to 90% lexical similarity throughout the country.
Hold on, lexical similarity. Okay, deep dive detour for a sec. What does that even mean, in plain English?
Fair enough. It basically just means how much the vocabularies are alike between different versions of a language.
Okay.
So 80 to 90%, that means most signs are going to be the same across Mexico. But yeah, there are definitely going to be some regional differences.
So, like, I don't know, the sign for family might be almost universal in LSM, but then one region might have their own, like, little twist on it.
Exactly. And it's not even just about like where you are geographically either. Our sources mention like age and even gender can actually play a role in how you sign.
Really?
Yeah, especially when it comes to numbers, apparently.
Man, the more we learn about LSM, it's like, whoa, more layers. Okay, so we know LSM is its own thing, right? It's totally distinct from Spanish, but our sources also mention something called Sign Spanish. What's the deal with that?
Ah, yeah, sign Spanish. This is where things can get a little blurry, I guess.
Okay.
It's not quite LSM, but it's not exactly like signing every single Spanish word either.
Okay, so what is it then?
Think of it more like a bridge between the two.
A bridge. How so?
Okay, picture this. Sign Spanish uses the vocabulary, like the actual signs from LSM.
Okay, got it.
But then it takes those signs
Yeah.
and like arranges them using Spanish word order and Spanish grammar rules.
So it's like taking all the ingredients of like one dish and then, I don't know, presenting them in a totally different way.
That is a great way to put it, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it can be helpful for people who are like already comfortable with Spanish grammar,
Yeah.
right? It kind of gives them some visual access even if they don't know full LSM.
Right. And our sources were saying it's often used by interpreters, you know, like for public service announcements and stuff like that. It's
Exactly.
about like finding that common ground.
Exactly. It serves a purpose. But it is super important to remember, sign Spanish is not the same as LSM. I mean, it's got its limitations.
For sure. And speaking of limitations, something that kind of jumped out at me from our sources was how they mentioned that the deaf community's understanding of Spanish itself can actually be quite low.
Yeah, and that is a really crucial point. Just because LSM exists in, a largely Spanish-speaking country,
Yeah.
that doesn't mean that there's this automatic fluency between the two. These are totally distinct languages, each with their own complexities.
It really challenges that assumption we might have that, like, if you're in Mexico, everybody's just like picking up Spanish effortlessly.
Right. And unfortunately, this assumption has very real consequences for LSM.
How so?
Well, you see, for years, the dominant approach to deaf education in Mexico was oralism.
Oralism.
Yeah, a method that basically prioritizes spoken language over signed languages.
So even though LSM is actually officially recognized as a language in Mexico,
Right.
this whole like emphasis on oralism must have created some huge obstacles.
Absolutely. Imagine like being told that the way you naturally communicate is somehow less than.
Right.
That you need to like conform to a completely different way of speaking just to be understood, just to be valued. I mean, come on.
Yeah. It's almost heartbreaking when you really think about it. Like this whole rich language, this vital part of deaf culture kind of just being, I don't know, pushed aside like that.
Exactly. And it just goes to show how important education is for a language's survival. Like, if LSM isn't taught, if it isn't valued in schools, then how can it possibly be passed on to future generations?
Right. It's like you were saying earlier, this isn't just about like words on a page, you know. This is about fostering a whole community where those words, where that language can really come to life.
Exactly. And thankfully, I mean, despite all these challenges, the LSM community, they've shown some serious resilience. I mean, remember how we were talking about its origins? That whole blend of old French Sign Language, those home signs that the students brought with them. I mean, that says a lot about the community's role in actually shaping their own language.
Yeah, like building it from the ground up. They didn't just sit around and wait for like permission or a textbook or something. They created what they needed to communicate.
Exactly. And that spirit, I mean, that's still alive today. Even though, yeah, oralism, it definitely created these huge obstacles. But LSM use is actually growing, especially near the U.S. border and even in places like Washington, D.C.
Really? That's actually really encouraging to hear. It sounds like, I don't know, maybe migration is playing a big part in that spread. Like people are taking their language with them as they, you know, move and build these new lives.
Oh, for sure. And it just goes to show how dynamic language is.
Yeah.
It travels, it adapts, it evolves right alongside the communities that use it.
Yeah.
And digging through all these sources, I actually came across some of the other names that LSM has been known by. Terms like señas español, lenguaje de las manos, even Lenguage Manual Mexicano.
It's kind of like, I don't know, it makes you wonder what stories those names tell. You
Yeah.
know, like how the understanding of LSM or maybe even the misinterpretations have kind of like shifted over time.
Right. Take señas español, for example.
Yeah.
It's a term that's still used within like the deaf community in Mexico.
Okay.
But it kind of feeds into that mistaken idea that we were talking about earlier, that it's just like Spanish with signs,
Sure.
that it's not really its own distinct system.
Right, right. And even something like lenguaje de las manos, which just basically means like language of the hands.
Right.
I mean, it's descriptive, yeah. But it just feels kind of, I don't know, lacking, doesn't it?
Exactly. It's like calling a symphony just like noise with instruments. You're
Yeah.
missing like all the nuance, the way that all those individual elements come together to create something so complex and so beautiful. And LSM is the same way. I mean,
Yeah.
it's so much more than just hand movements. It's facial expressions, it's body language, it's like this whole cultural understanding all woven together.
Wow. This whole deep dive has honestly been like eye-opening. It makes you realize how much we like take for granted when it comes to language, and
Right.
especially like visual languages like LSM.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so many ways to communicate out there, so many ways to like experience and express the world around us. And each language, each dialect, it carries its own unique history, its own struggles, its own triumphs.
It's a good reminder to kind of, I don't know, like challenge those assumptions that we all have, you know,
Mhm.
to stay curious and to be open to these new ways of seeing things.
Because who knows what kind of fascinating discoveries are out there just waiting for us when we, actually step outside of what's familiar.
It's true. So to our listener out there, if this deep dive has, sparked your curiosity even a little bit, don't let it stop here. I mean, there are some really amazing resources online. There are ways to actually connect with the deaf community, maybe even try learning some basic LSM yourself.
Yeah. Trust me, you might be surprised at what you discover. And not just about language, but about yourself and like the whole world around you.
And that is what the deep dive is all about.